A record number of young people are giving up on work. Nearly a third of people aged 18 to 24 are classed as economically inactive, either studying or dropping out of the labour market completely. In 2012, youth inactivity due to poor health was just 8%. Today it's nearly a quarter, with poor mental health being the primary cause of this rising inactivity. Amongst all age groups, it is those people aged 18 to 24 who report the greatest dissatisfaction with their health. And this is the biggest concern: young people not in work, but not in education or training either. It's something called NEET. And it's not just about inactivity though. Gen Z have different attitudes to work itself, with a rise in work disenfranchisement and new trends such as lazy Mondays, hush trips, and just not turning up. Since 2019, there's been a 55% rise in the number of days taken off sick. And this is a major problem. It's a big factor behind the UK's poor productivity and poor economic growth. Now, personally, I've lost track of the number of employers who complain about the difficulty of employing young people in the past couple of years. Flaky, entitled, and lacking motivation are some of the adjectives used to describe the new generation of workers. But this generational contempt for young people is nothing new. Even back in ancient Greece, Socrates himself was lamenting the youth for their bad manners, greed, and contempt for authority. Are the old work values of impressing the boss by staying at your desk for hours on end even desirable? Could we actually learn something from a new generation about a better work-life balance? Well, firstly, there is definitely a new growing phenomenon of disengaged workers, younger employees who feel less connected and less motivated. Now, reasons for this demotivation include the gloomy economic outlook, the sense that jobs are insecure, low paid, and also an awareness that there are better alternatives to working for a boss. In the past, there were very few alternatives to a classic 9-to-5 job, but Generation Z have grown up seeing people make a living from YouTube, Instagram, and online selling. An independent content creator is more desirable than doing a so-called bullshit job for a hard taskmaster. And in this regard, I do have some sympathy. I used to have a proper teaching job, 45 hours a week, but I wanted to spend more time cycling, so I gave up teaching and set up a website and then YouTube channel. So this could be seen as a positive aspect of the new work culture, being able to say no to the constant demands of your boss, refusing to answer work emails outside of work hours, and a willingness to say no to tasks which are more for show than actual productivity. And of course, the ultimate sanction is not to work at all. Now, COVID and other cultural shifts have certainly created a new sense of freedom from traditional values. Firstly, people are having fewer children and settling down later in life. And in fact, the rise in inactivity would have been even greater if it wasn't for the fact that young women are much less likely to be having children and looking after them. In 2012, 45% of young women who were NEET were due to looking after children. In 2023, it's just 22%. Now, workplace disenfranchisement is also exacerbated by the sense that many jobs are insecure, low paid, especially compared to extortionate housing costs. Young people renting their own place can easily be paying up to 30, 40, even 50% of their disposable income on renting. And it's no surprise that some have responded to this cost of living crisis by returning to stay with their parents. In the past few years, the number living with their parents has gone up as a share of the young people. And also, in fact, there are reports of young people having to turn down jobs due to the high cost of renting in big cities, high cost of commuting, even the high cost of starting a job with buying work clothes, etc. Another challenge young people face in a fast-changing labour market is that there's been a decline in many traditional jobs being replaced by jobs with insecure contracts, unsocial hours, or very high skill requirements which they don't have. The Resolution Foundation report a strong link between poor health and poor qualifications. 80% of young people who are inactive don't have any qualifications above GCSEs. And yet, with a cost of living crisis, 34% of those inactive claim they can't afford to study for the qualifications which would be needed for their preferred job. And this is a real concern because it's one way out of inactivity is to get better skilled and get the option of getting better jobs. Another big concern is that the share of young people with a mental disorder has risen from 10% in 2017 to 26% in 2022. Now, 2/3 of people argue that rising use of social media is a factor behind this trend. Too much comparison, intrusion, and a sense of judgment are exactly the kind of factors that can exacerbate existing stress. Now, young people themselves are more likely to blame economic factors, economic stresses such as rising housing costs and stagnation in real wages and the insecurity of modern day work. And it is true that in previous decades, people had a reasonable expectation that things would get better, real wages would rise, and they would be able to afford their own home. Yet for the new generation, the goal of home ownership seems like a pipe dream, with house price to incomes near a record level. And for a graduate who graduates with an average of $45,000 student debt, then having to save for the average deposit of almost the same amount, about $47,000, is incredibly challenging without probably parental support. Now, on the one hand, you could argue that all these economic challenges, high cost of living, may encourage young people to actually work even harder, and there are some who have to juggle multiple jobs to meet all their bills. But on the other hand, there's another section of the workforce who kind of take themselves out of it completely, becoming economically inactive. And the increased stringency of unemployment benefits means that there's a pathway or a reason to try to shift onto health-related benefits which are more generous than unemployment benefits. What about the so-called flakiness of young workers? Is this fair? I mean, certainly I have heard several employers say that, especially since COVID, young workers are much more likely to phone in sick. And this is backed up by evidence which suggests there's been a 55% rise in the number of sick days. Now, the $1 million question is this because people are actually sicker, or is it because of differing expectations? Have we had a taste of working from home during COVID we don't want to give up? Now, I've got a friend who works at a university, and she says that students are much more aware of how to gain extensions for their essays using excuses like family deaths, stress, illness, or pre-existing conditions. And whilst quite a few are, of course, genuine, there's a sense that quite a few do know how to game the system. Now, the reason I mention that is that I know another friend, manager at a bookshop, and she admitted that it's kind of dreads employing students because too many bad experiences of them not turning up, using a similar excuse to why they can't do an essay on time. Now, there's no doubt that the whole COVID episode was a big shock to work and to general work expectations. Firstly, long COVID, combined with a rising waiting lists and pressure on the healthcare system, is a factor behind growing ill health, especially when mental health for young people is so poorly funded, very hard to see a specialist to treat it. But also the shift to working from home has proved surprisingly difficult to reverse. Once you get a taste of working from home or maybe even a cafe, it can be hard to do all that commuting to go back to face-to-face meetings. And again, I have a lot of sympathy with that, working from home myself. Yet when we talk about Generation Z being difficult and wanting to stick to work boundaries, is this laziness or just being aware that there's a better way of doing things? Certainly in the past, many jobs had a strong ethos of working very long hours and doing everything that was asked, even if it meant making 1,000 cups of tea a week, because this was seen as the way to get ahead. A younger generation may be more able to see through this as a false way of appearing to be willing to work rather than being genuinely productive. rather than spend hours in pointless meetings and sitting at your desk for the sake of it. They have an aspiration to make a more meaningful contribution, and if they can't find it in the corporate environment, they're willing to look elsewhere for it. Gallup research in Japan earlier this year found that just 6% of employees feel engaged at work in Japan. This is a society that has a long culture of working very long hours for the sake of it. And the UK, to some extent, has an element of that in many careers and industries. And the desire to avoid overwork will be especially acute if you already have some kind of health issues, be it mental health or physical issues. The World Health Organization found that in 2016, nearly 750,000 people died early from overwork due to things like stroke and heart disease. So it can be a real killer. And if you've got bad health already, understandably, there's a reluctance to enter that workplace, which increases that kind of stress. So the real reason for the rising inactivity is surprisingly difficult to reduce to just one factor. I think there are some quite positive trends, such as a willingness to want to avoid wasteful work, avoid being there for the sake of it, not wanting to be taken advantage of but make some meaningful contribution. More worryingly is the rise in mental health related illnesses, which aren't so easily to diagnose and understand what's going on. Also, there's all the economic pressures and the new job market with a lot of insecure, low-paid work, and the big skills gap, which is getting worse with the increasing technological nature of new jobs. Also, there's an interesting correlation between falling birth rates and economic inactivity. To understand work is also worth understanding why birth rates are falling across Western societies and the impact that will have in the future.